Very pleased to welcome back to the Hugh Hewitt Show, but first time as Vice President J.D. Vance. Mr. Vice President, welcome back. It's good to talk to you.
It's good to talk with you. Hugh, how are you?
I am great. I've been spending the morning listening to the American Cardinals talk about Leo the 14th and reading about Leo the 14th because, like you, I am a Catholic. I'm wondering what your reaction is, sort of at length over the course of the day since that news came down.
Yeah, well, you look, I watched with bated breath. I think they let the white smoke go off, and then they just sort of, hold us there without giving us the news. I was starting to sort of, I was watching it with my staff, and I was like, my God, we've had white smoke for a long time. Why can't they just show this guy? Because I was on the edge of my seat like a lot of other people. I mean, look, I have a few thoughts in response to you. First of all, a big moment, of course, for American Catholics, and I think the American people writ large. So many people my entire lifetime have said you're never going to have an American Pope. Obviously now we do, so I think that's a great thing. The second thing I'd say is, we don't know a whole lot about him, but I just wish him the best, right? I'm a Catholic. He's now the head of the Catholic Church, and we'll pray for his wisdom, for his good decisions and his good health, and hope that he has a long and successful papacy. And then the third thing, Hugh, and this is, these things always get discolored a little bit by American politics or by, politics writ large. People are asking, is he a conservative or is he a liberal? Well, he's attacked, President Trump and J.D. Vance on certain things and hasn't attacked Democrats on other things. And I guess my response to this is it's very hard to fit a 2,000-year-old institution into the politics of 2025 America. I try not to do that. I am a Catholic convert, and so I come at this maybe with a slightly different perspective, but I try not to play the politicization of the Pope game. I'm sure he's going to say a lot of things that I love. I'm sure he'll say some things that I disagree with, but I'll continue to pray for him in the church despite it all and through it all, and that'll be the way that I handle it.
When you watch the press conference, it's a wonderful press conference, but the American media never fail to understand the Catholic Church. And 3 out of the first 4 questions are about President Trump. And, the Cardinals are just kind of waving them off, but they're digging in, Terry Moran, another reporter. And I just thought they really never failed to not understand the Catholic Church. You and I used to go to the same church in Virginia. I don't know if you do anymore, but the local church doesn't have anything to do with politics. You have no idea who's in the pews. Do you find any journalists who actually understand that who are not actually Catholic journalists?
No, I don't, Hugh, and I think it's really disappointing because the church is so much bigger than politics. Obviously, there are 1.3 billion Catholics. There are about I don't know, probably 100 million or so American Catholics, maybe a little bit smaller than that. But it's a big institution with a lot of members, and most of the people are not thinking about whether the Pope is a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative or a liberal. And the truth is, Hugh, as you know well, that there are a lot of views the Catholic leadership holds that are you might consider on the right side of the spectrum. There are a lot of views they're going to hold that might be more traditionally on the left side of the spectrum. And then there are a lot of views that don't map easily onto politics at all. And my attitude is, the church is about saving souls and about spreading the gospel. And yeah, it's going to touch public policy from time to time, as all human institutions do. But that's not really what it's about. And I think it's much healthier for the American media and certainly for Catholics to not take such a, politics in the age of social media attitude towards the papacy. I just think it's bigger than that, and it's sort of tangential to that in so many ways. And I think it's a lot healthier way to go through life is to do that as opposed to focus obsessively on the politics. And by the way, Hugh, that's true for liberals and conservatives. I think it would be better for all of us if we allowed the church to be about the saving of souls and didn't try to fit it into a preordained political box.
Now, I know you've been busy this morning. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it. The Wall Street Journal excerpted the new Pope's first sermon at the Mass in the Sistine Chapel this morning. He said, "There are many settings in which the Christian faith is considered absurd, meant for the weak and unintelligent, settings where other securities are preferred like technology, money, success, power, or pleasure. They are the places where our missionary outreach is desperately needed. There are many settings in which Jesus, although appreciated as a man, is reduced to a kind of charismatic leader or Superman. This is the world that has been entrusted to us. How do you respond to that?
Well, it's quite beautiful, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
And if you think the way that I do and believe what I believe, I think it's also true. There is a tendency to try to make Jesus Christ this sort of very wise, I guess, young man, to make him a sort of teacher, maybe a prophet. But of course, Christians believe that he was much more than that. He was, in fact, the living, breathing Son of God. And so I think it's, again, powerful words from an American Pope that we don't know a lot about. But I think what I heard you just repeat to me was quite beautiful. It was quite moving, and I hope it's indicative of the kind of church that we'll have under the leadership of Leo XIV.
I agree. Two more quick Pope questions, Mr. Vice President. The former Pope whom you met, the most criticized aspect of his papacy, I think, was the deal that he okayed with the Chinese Communist Party that allowed the Chinese Communists to co-pick bishops there, and that he never spoke up for Jimmy Lai. I talked with President Trump about Jimmy Lai on Wednesday. I talked to Secretary Rubio a couple of weeks about Jimmy Lai. Has Jimmy Lai come up in any of your conversations yet about the need to get him out of prison before he dies?
Yeah, I mean, look, we certainly have talked about it in the administration. We've been here about 110 days, Hugh, and we would love to get him out of China. But it's come up in general terms. I don't know that we're closer now than we were a few months ago to getting him out of China, but certainly we think about him and we care a lot about him.
All right. Let me move now to foreign leaders. When Richard Nixon was a new vice president in 1953, Ike sent him on a 19-country tour that lasted 2 months, October, November, into December of 1953, and so he could meet all these world leaders. I see the president, including you, not only sending you to Germany and the Vatican, all these, but every meeting, whether it's Prime Minister Modi or Prime Minister Netanyahu or President Zelensky, you're in every meeting. How do you find that? Is that fascinating? Are you learning so much more than you ever knew?
That's exactly right, Hugh. It is incredibly fascinating, and I'm learning a whole lot. Just one about the president's instincts. He's a successful president for many reasons, but the thing that I'm always amazed by is he has just an incredible instinctual ability to sort of know when to interject, when to sort of let somebody else talk, when to move the conversation in a different direction. He's just a very instinctual person. I think it's the core of his success as a president, certainly in foreign policy. But it's been amazing. And as you know, Hugh, we've got 3 little kids. We've been able to take our kids on a lot of these trips with us and make it really a family affair. And it's an amazing learning experience. I think that we're doing good work for the American people, which, of course, is the most important part. But if you can pick up some new skills and some knowledge along the way, then that's a win-win scenario.
I just think it's an amazing opportunity and good preparation should anything terrible ever happen. Now, Mr. Vice President, I want to turn to something I talked with the president about, Trump derangement syndrome. You've now been campaigning with him and talking with him very much, often, for almost a year, and you've known him for far longer than that. And you know how American journalism is. I asked him about the Atlantic cover that came out. It's later than you think. Ann Applebaum, David Brooks, Aziz Hug, and George Packer fighting autocracy. This very morning, the New Yorker's Susan Glasser has been a guest on my program before. I used to read her. I don't now. A day in the live stream life of Donald Trump. Have you noticed that he just unbalances otherwise sane people?
I have noticed that, Hugh, and it's one of the most bizarre things because if you know the president at all, you know that he's very kind, he's very gracious. I mean, I was in a meeting with the president yesterday, and my 5-year-old called me on FaceTime. You know, sometimes when he's on his way home from preschool, he'll use the Secret Service will let him FaceTime, and he calls me, and the president's like, pick it up. And I answer it, and he talks with my 5-year-old in the middle of a meeting in the Oval Office. That happened yesterday. Like, that's the kind of guy that he actually is. But, you know, if I could say a word in slight defense of some of these Atlantic writers, yes, they're crazy, but I think that their craziness reveals something that's very exhausted about their worldview. I mean, if you think about this, Hugh, These guys have been making the same arguments for 40 years. They've been making the same arguments about what we should do from a foreign policy perspective, weakness on the world stage, the same argument about what we should do on economic policy. And I think they sense that even among left-leaning individuals, their worldview is totally exhausted. And so they don't have
Pause there
anymore.
for a moment. We will come back with Vice President Vance, with whom I spoke right before the show this afternoon, and I want you to hear it all unbroken, so I will return with the Vice President. About an hour and a half ago, I spoke with Vice President Vance. Let's get back to that interview.
Among left-leaning individuals, their worldview is totally exhausted. And so they don't have anything anymore. They don't have a positive, constructive vision for America in 2025. What they do have is this unhinged obsession with one person. And I don't know what's going to happen. I almost worry for their sanity when Donald Trump decides that he's no longer interested in American politics, because he is the thing that gives them meaning. Hating Donald Trump is what gives so many of these writers meaning. It's sad. It's not good for the country. But I do think it comes from a much deeper place, an exhausted worldview that doesn't work in the 21st century.
Now, that's very interesting. I don't know why it comes, but I do know what the tell is. When they attribute to people thoughts, when they assume the power of telepathy and tell me what other people are thinking, that's just such a tell that they've gone off of the edge of reporting and into the edge of psychiatry, for which they are not licensed. You are a Yale lawyer, Mr. Vice President. Has President Trump asked you to help him in the selection of judicial nominees?
So we haven't had that many judicial nominations, Hugh, and so we just nominated a great candidate, a young woman, to the Sixth Circuit vacancy in Tennessee. I think she's very impressive, and of course, me and the president spoke about that. I think we have, of course, a Supreme Court nominee. We'll talk about that. We've talked about some other judicial nominations. So, he asked my counsel and my input, but we also haven't had as many, high impact or at least high visibility appointments to make. I'm sure that when we do, I'll get a little bit more involved in that process.
I know Vice President Pence, when he was serving in your office, he had the last interview with every Supreme Court nominee potential. And if you are in that position down the road, what do you want to know about a Supreme Court nominee?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never been asked that question, Hugh. You always ask the best questions, man. But, I guess what I would try to understand is how persuadable they are by the mob. Because what we've learned from our Supreme Court over the last 10, 15 years, but especially over the last few years, is that the mob really comes after these guys for high-profile decisions. And obviously, you don't want to prejudge an outcome, but I just want a person with real courage. I think this is what makes Alito and Thomas so special, is that they're just willing to stand in defiance of a lot of incredible media and social pressure. I mean, if you're in the Supreme Court, you are literally inside the Beltway. You consume Beltway media. That's who you see day to day. You have to have a particular special character. And so I guess I'd ask some questions that try to tease that out a little bit. I'd ask them, when have they ever stood up to the crowd? When have they ever, had people attack them for their views? And if they've never, ever had to stand up to public pressure, they're probably not the right person for the Supreme Court.
Now, Mr. Vice President, I've never asked you before at Yale. I don't know if you had a Yale MR or who you had for con law, but I hope they taught you the Bob Jones case, because that divided the DOJ back in when I was a DOJ lawyer.
Sure.
And I think it's 4 points square on top of Harvard and Columbia right now. I think if you violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, you ought to lose your tax-exempt status. Has that been talked about in the White House? I brought it up with the president. I don't think these institutions deserve tax-exempt status if they don't protect the Jewish students on their campus.
Yes, we have certainly talked about this. And, obviously we want to protect Jewish students on campus. We want to protect everybody on campus to be able to speak their mind, to be able to participate in public spaces, to be able to go to the library without crazy people in veils trying to destroy, the library, to destroy the public space. And importantly, Hugh, we want to protect people against racial discrimination, whether you're discriminating against somebody because they're Jewish or because they're black or because they're white, which does happen in academia. You should not receive federal funding. And the way that I put it is actually quite simple. If you're violating the Civil Rights Act, then you're not going to receive federal funding and you're not going to receive a federal subsidy via tax exemption. It's just basic stuff. And unfortunately, the Democrats have gotten so addicted to this idea that you're going to put, one person in this group and another person in that group and hand out rewards and also punishments based on membership in these racial categories that they don't even know how to make an argument in the world that we wake up in. It's not we're attacking you because of your worldview or we're attacking you because you said something that we didn't like. It's we're actually exposing you to the force of law. When you violate the law, it's very, very simple stuff.
Mr. Vice President, I'm cognizant of your time. 3 last questions. First, Xi Jinping. I think he's the most ruthless man in the world, and I think he's a communist. Do you understand him as a hardcore Leninist as I do, or do you think there's a different angle to take on him?
Yeah, I think you and I maybe have talked about this, Hugh. I think he's a fascinating guy. He is ruthless. He's tough. He obviously is looking out for the best interests of China, just as we have a very tough leader looking out for the best interests of the United States of America. But, I really don't have a good insight into his underlying philosophy. I think it's probably the case that he's a hardcore Leninist. I've tried to understand him, but I think there's something about the Chinese system, Hugh, that is just very, very hard for the Western mind to grasp. And I try to be a little bit humble about what I know and don't know about China, because I think it's such a different system that it raises questions that don't even quite compute. It's they're literally speaking a different language, and I think that's hard for us to fully apprehend. And it's one of the major blind spots, Hugh, that we have in American public policy. There are a few places that we get really well. Like I think we get Europe very well. I think we get the Middle East quite well. I think we understand most countries in Africa pretty well. I think we actually have a real strategic blind spot vis-a-vis the Chinese, and we have to close that gap. And not to say too many nice things about my boss here, but one of the things that I think is unique about President Trump is he really tries to understand where Xi is coming from. He tries to understand his motivations, and because of that, yes, he's going to rebalance global trade, but I think he's going to do it in a way that hopefully preserves America's, I think he's definitely going to do it in a way that preserves America's upper hand in the global balance of trade and the global balance of power. But I think, interestingly, President Trump has no ill will towards Xi and no ill will towards China. He wants to look out for America, and his main criticism, it's fascinating, is not actually of the Chinese, it's of America for allowing the Chinese to take advantage of us, of American leadership in particular. And I think the president's dead right about that.
Subtle answer. I've been dead wrong about China since Deng Xiaoping. I mean, I was really wrong about which way they would go. So that's a subtle observation. Penultimate question. Pause it there. I would like to play the last bit of the interview, which is about Iran, for Matt Cottonetti, who's coming up next, about whom I've had many conversations about Iran. So I have about 2 minutes left of the interview with Vice President Vance that I taped an hour and a half ago. And I want Matt to hear that as I play it for you. We've posted, by the way, the transcript. Dwayne has done it. It's already posted at hughhewitt.com. Harley has already posted the entire audio and video of Vice President Trump over at Hugh Hewitt's YouTube channel. So if you want to listen to it again or you missed the stuff about Pope Leo the 14th, go over to the YouTube channel and you'll find it there, or the transcript. If you just want to read what he had to say, it's quicker than watching. Then by all means, head over to hughhewitt.com and look for the transcript at the top. Matt Continenti is, of course, with the American Enterprise Institute, Commentary Magazine, the Free Press, pretty much everywhere. Matt, how are you?
I'm well, Hugh. Good to see you.
I have to impose on you. I've got to play 2 minutes of the rest of my interview with J.D. Vance before we talk about it and the American Pope. So here is that 2 minutes. On Wednesday, the president told me Iran has two choices. They can have their centrifuges destroyed nicely or viciously. And everyone tries to put you in opposition, and some so, quote, restrainers camp. How do you comment on those who are trying to drive a wedge between you and the president on Iran?
Well, it's just totally bogus, Hugh, and it's funny, man, because I'm in these conversations, obviously, with Marco and the Secretary of State, with Pete, the Secretary of Defense, with a lot of the other president's senior advisors, and we're all very much on the same team. The president's been clear. He wants a deal. He would like to eliminate the Iranian nuclear weapons program peacefully, but he's going to eliminate it. He's just drawn a very clear red line. Iran can't get a nuclear weapon. That is the policy of the President of the United States. And we all, of course, have our own views about how best to implement this policy, but it's so funny to hear these media reports that say that, JD and Marco are in one camp and the president's in another camp, or JD and the president are in one camp and, the chief of staff is in another camp. It's all completely made up BS. We are all aligned to try to implement the president's agenda. And on this one, it's just so clear. Iran doesn't get to have a nuclear weapon. That's the policy of the United States government. The president's going to see it through, hopefully peacefully, but we're going to see it through however we have to.
Thank you for that. Last question's quick, just because there's so much discussion about Pope Leo having been a Cubs fan when it turns out he's a White Sox fan. Are you on the side of good that you're a Guardians fan, or are you on the side of evil and you're a Reds fan?
I am, unfortunately, Hugh, a Reds fan. I grew up in Cincinnati. I've always been a Cincinnati sports fan, Bengals and Reds all the way. Though I had a friend of mine that, had a pretty funny take on this. He said, if Pope Leo really is a Chicago White Sox fan, then he's already actually faced the stress of martyrdom multiple times. So maybe we have a real winner in the new Holy Father.
Vice President Vance, good to talk to you again. Come back early and often, and thank you for the time today.
All right. See you, Hugh. Take care, man.
Bye-bye. So, Matt Continenti, aside from baseball talk, you've read the transcript. What did you take away from Vice President Vance's conversation about the Pope, Iran, China, anything?
Well, Hugh, I thought it was a very open interview. I thought the vice president came across as very relaxed. You could tell, I think, the intensity of his faith, of his Catholicism, his willingness to really get into details about the new Pope, his reaction to it, what his hopes for are. And you saw there, of course, in that last question on Iran, the vice president saying that there's no daylight between him and President Trump on the issue of the Iranian nuclear program and Iran's ability to obtain a nuclear weapon. I thought the president, in your interview with President Trump earlier this week, put it very well. He said to the Iranians, talking to you, Hugh, blow them up nicely or we'll blow them up viciously. And I think that captures the Trump doctrine in one totally unique phrase, as we're used to from the president.
Now, I do know, because I talked to J-Pod about this, John Podhoretz, he still worries. Do you run into people who still worry that somehow we'll end up with the son of JCPOA?
Well, you always have that fear in the back of your mind. But I'd say that in the past week or so, the consistency of the president's message, not just of the past week, but when you consider that he has been saying the same thing since he entered the presidential arena in 2015, that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, that the Obama nuclear deal was the worst deal in history, that he's proud that he removed the United States from that deal in 2018. And then again and again and again, Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. And of course, President Trump has also said in several interviews in recent weeks that he doesn't see why the Iranians should have a civil nuclear program. He doesn't understand why the Iranians sitting on this oil field, gas fields. They have more than enough oil and gas to supply their own energy needs. There's really no reason to have a civilian nuclear program to President Trump's mind. And he even said, what starts out as a civilian program often ends up as a military program. So I think in his eagerness to solve this peacefully, he has drawn a red line around the idea of enrichment. No enrichment. If they want to have a civilian nuclear program at the Isfahan site, which is the site that Special Envoy Steve Witkoff specifically mentioned today in his interview with Breitbart.com, they're going to have to get the uranium processed from outside the country.
Matt, you're a great guy. Donald Trump told me that this week when I brought up your commencement speech analysis. So you're a great guy. I hope you get to sit down with him and talk with him at length. Tell me what the reaction among your friends was to your laudatory column on a very good speech, and I thought you came at it the right way. I thought it was an excellent column.
Well, thank you, Hugh. I appreciate that. And of course, I really appreciate the president's words to you in your interview with him earlier this week. Look, Trump doesn't get, I think, the attention he deserves. Now, it's very odd to say that, right? He's the most famous person in the world, the most powerful person in the world for about 10 years now. But so often our media just simply cover what they're used to covering, the political messaging, the ad libs, the jokes. That's what they care about. That's what outrages their audience. And so that's what they pay attention to. And what I found at this commencement speech was that was only half the story. The rest of the speech were these 10 pieces of advice that Donald Trump was giving the graduates. And what I found most interesting about these pieces of advice was what they revealed about Trump himself, how he thinks, the people that mattered to him, the examples that he follows in his life. And so I try to lay them out in this column at the Free Press, go through all 10 and talk about how combined, when you look at them, you get a portrait of Donald Trump who is, love him or hate him, and people feel both ways, but he is undeniably an American original, and I think will be treated as such in the history books.
Of the 10 points, I thought the most important was don't lose your momentum. What did you think was the pyramid of points among the 10?
Yeah, I thought that momentum one was very interesting as well. He used specifically a story of his encounters with William Levitt, the famous developer of the Levitt towns, the really kind of the main driver of suburbanization in America after the Second World War. And the president described meeting him at a party late in Levitt's life, and Levitt saying that I had lost my momentum and my career never recovered. And when I heard that story and the president telling it, I said, well, this explains why he just doesn't stop. He's never stopped. I mean, even from when he was criticizing Obama in Obama's first term and flirting with the idea of running for president in 2012, it has been nonstop ever since. And I think that fear that of winding up like Levitt, having years of your life left where you're still not making a difference and being the center of attention, does drive the president to just go full charge. When you consider all of the crises that he's dealing with at any given moment, and he doesn't really flag. There's so many balls up in the air, right? I mean, he's an expert juggler, but I think it comes from that idea that you just can't stop going until you absolutely have to. He even coined a phrase. He goes, I call it momentum time, is what he says. And at some point you lose your momentum, but the momentum time is something Trump cares about a lot, and he's definitely not losing his right now.
Yesterday really was a very, very significant day. Matt Cottonetti, my guest from AEI, the Free Press and Commentary magazine and podcast, because we've had popes for 2,000 years. The only institution older than that I'm aware of is Judaism. And so Christianity goes back a long way, and the Catholic Church goes back a long way. And now we have an American pope. And the significance of that's going to take a while for me to get my arms around as a Catholic. You're not a Catholic. What do you think of it?
Well, I think it's amazing. I think it's something that most of us thought we would never see in history, an American pope. And Pope Leo is unique. I mean, he's born and raised in America. He went to Villanova. He spent a lot of his life in Peru. And of course, interestingly enough, in his opening message after his election yesterday, he did not speak English, though I noticed that he opened his homily, his first homily as Pope this morning, with an English paragraph. It's going to be really fun to watch. I mean, I'm just excited for when he visits the United States and goes to Chicago. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, it's going to be a huge event. Also, the age of the Pope. He's 69 years old, which gives him potentially decades to influence the church, influence the world. And I've been struck, Hugh, as well. I think there's a great sense of kind of optimism about this Pope. We immediately rush to get our partisan bearings and try to interpret this office, which kind of transcends domestic politics and American politics into a blue-red paradigm. But I think there are people, no matter where you stand within Catholicism on some of these questions, you can see Pope Leo as a potential bridge builder, or someone who at least is not, I think, aiming toward stirring up strife within the church. That may be one reason why he was elected so quickly. I mean, it's pretty incredible. The fourth ballot, really the second day of the conclave, they settled on this man who, it was just, I was watching live as the president was when he was announced, and just to see the crowd, it was extremely moving. Just a great day, I think.
I think there has been a piece written about how extraordinary it will be to have a president who knows his English like you know English and I know English, speaking to American Catholicism, which as a Catholic I can say is very divided, but not along red and blue lines, but along traditionalist, reformist, progressive lines. And there's a lot of mix in there, and it's very hard to diagram it. But I can understand an American pope, even if he's been 20 years in Peru and 10 years in the Vatican, I'll understand him, and I'll know what point. In fact, he'll be able to be subtle with us. And I don't know if you follow consistories. That's when you elevate people to the red hat, the cardinal. And that's been the real burr under my saddle. Francis passed over Archbishop Gomez, Archbishop Chaput, traditionalists who ought to traditionally have received a red hat. And it just made, they were Opus Dei or conservative, Opus Dei in the case of Gomez and just center right in the case of Chaput. But I don't know, I'm hopeful. And I don't know any Catholic I've talked to who isn't.
Yeah. No, and like I said, that's what really strikes me. I think there are a few things to look for. One is, his attitude toward the traditional rite, the Latin Mass. Is he going to be more accepting of it than his predecessor was? I think China is another issue we should pay attention to. Is he going to allow the CCP to continue to play an intrusive role in the church in China? Is he going to speak out for religious freedom in China? And then, I think there's this question of, is he going to continue kind of the bureaucratic processes that Francis began that kind of lead to internal divisions on the church? I don't know. I think it was really striking. He chose his name, Leo XIV. Leo XIII was a pope who actually had a lot to offer for both the left and the right at the time. He was a traditionalist in many ways, but he was also a social critic of some of the effects of capitalism, but he was also very anti-socialist. And I thought that name means a lot. I also thought it was significant, as some observers pointed out, that when he appeared on the balcony, he appeared in the more traditional dress, which Francis did not do. I also think
one of the American Cardinals today, I can't remember which one, said Leo the Great's another Leo, and the Vatican was in total disrepair when he took over. There are questions about the fiscal stability of the Vatican. Now, the church will never be bankrupt, but they're not going to sell the Sistine Chapel. They really are upside down and opaque. That he might just be the brain they needed to come in and bring some modernity to their books.
Yeah, that was another word that I heard tossed around a lot as people were talking about the new Pope Leo. They mentioned that he was a great administrator, and I think that's something that the church needs. Francis was someone who was he wanted to be among people. He cared very much about the poor, but he was also, in a way, no pun intended, a pontificator, right? He liked to kind of say what he thought about what was going on in the world, and he commented on politics and his own role. And that may have created some of these more administrative difficulties, or allowed these administrative difficulties to worsen over his 12 years as Pope. And so Leo has a great opportunity here to kind of, I think, if what I'm hearing is correct, really be an administrator, really get some of these things in order.
It's such a big organization. The vice president alluded to this. It's everywhere on the globe. It's persecuted in some places like Nigeria and China. In other places, it's divided along traditionalist, progressive lines, and in other places, it's doing just fine. But what the vice president responded to my comment, nobody really knows in the pews who's thinking what. It's the silliest attempt. The American media today immediately began asking about Trump. 30 seconds to our break. Are they always going to do that? Like 20 years from now, do you expect the American media to be asking people about Trump, Matt?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I do. And that's why we need to find good alternative media sources, other media sources that actually have their heads straight and don't reduce every single thing to Donald John Trump.
This is 1 minute to the break. That's why I love Commentary Pod. It's also why I love the free press. Is the free press going to take over media? I mean, there'll be niches, but it's really growing fast.
It's expanding. It's a great publication to be a part of. I think it offers a lot of different things for readers: culture, hot takes, what's in the news, politics, and it does so with a a viewpoint diversity, which is always important in a publication.
Yes.
You get a range of views and a sense of humor. That's always what I look for.
Matt, I'm holding up my iPhone, which has on it the book that I'm listening to, The Day Is Now Far Spent by Robert Cardinal Sarah, who is a senior African cardinal. And it's quite bleak about everything that's wrong with the West. Its emptiness, its loss of sense of history, its willingness to allow people from Africa to make this journey, the failure to stop it's really one of the bleakest things ever about the West. Have you ever heard of him or understood this critique?
Oh yeah, I've heard of Cardinal Sarah for many years. He's very conservative, which I like, and I am familiar with that broader critique about the problems of the West and Western civilization, and I agree with much of it. There is a paradox, Hugh, though, that as many problems that the West has, it seems like most people want to get here, right? I mean, we had to deal with this open border and this illegal immigration crisis because despite all of our problems in the United States, there's just a desire to be part of Western civilization, part of the project. So what does that mean? I mean, I think it means that we have to, one, address our public policy problems, but the other part is we have to recapture kind of what made our civilization great. That means reinvigorating our traditions, being proud of them, having a sense of inheritance, and not being willing to apologize for it. And I also think it means that those more traditional social structures, like the family in particular, or like the church, like your local community, they really need to be strengthened. And we need to think of ways in which we can help them, because those are the institutions that are going to reinvigorate our society, our civilization, and I think maybe allay some of the cardinals' very real concerns.
Last quick. Cardinal Sarah thinks Africa is being emptied on a false hope for the people who are leaving, the talented people who are trying to get to Europe. He's mostly concerned with Europe, and that Europe is not stopping this. Almost willingly, they're not stopping this. Do you think that's 30 seconds? We got 30 seconds. Paralysis?
Yeah. Well, the brain drain for Africa is going to be very severe and terrible for the continent if people, once they have the means to try to make that journey to Europe, take off. And of course, Africa is the one place in the world where the demography is exploding, and we're going to have to be dealing with African migration and the politics of Africa in the decades ahead. America, I think, has an edge over Europe in a lot of these problems, and Europe is going to have to get serious.
Africa deserves better than we're giving it. Matt Cottonetti, thank you. Follow him on X at Continenti. Talk to you next Friday. Matt Cottonetti and I just finished our conversation abruptly. I always do that to Matt, but he's always a gentleman. I would recommend to you that you listen to the entire Big Weekend pod that drops late tonight, so that you have something to listen to on Saturday morning with the Vice President, with Matt Cottonetti, with Ben Domenech. It's always a good listen. And I think we have Andy McCarthy today. Don't know if we have Garrity back yet, but it'll all be on tomorrow's podcast. Time for me to tell you about Relief Factor, especially if you're new to the show. And there are always new people every day watching on the Salem News Channel, listening on one of our fabulous radio affiliates. We just added a new one, AM 600, FM 101.1 WBOB in Duval, Jacksonville. This is Relief Factor. It's a packet of Relief Factor. Opens up this easily. See how I love their packaging. I'm a design freak. And so 4 pills, and there's a little Trader Joe's sparkling water, and down it goes. 4 pills. That's because they coat them well. They make them the right size. If you take these every day for 3 weeks, most of you, can't say everyone, will find that your minor aches and pains are reduced, if not gone. Now, I've done so many events. I'm doing one tomorrow night in, I think, the Twin Cities. I'm flying in tomorrow afternoon, leaving on Sunday morning, so it's one of those weekends with the overhead bin. But I'm taking my Relief Factor with me, as I always do, and take it every day because the dreaded overhead bin. But I'm on the road. I'm traveling a lot. And what Relief Factor does is keep you going. And we were talking about momentum in President Trump's commencement speech in Alabama. And with Matt Continenti, and momentum simply comes from continuing. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. A body at rest tends to stay at rest. Well, you want to stay in motion. You want to stay using relieffactor.com. Let me check the markets brought to you by AmericanFederal.com. 1-800. You can see it there on the bottom of the screen if you're watching on the Salem News Channel. Nick Grovich and his team, 1-800-221-7694. They buy and sell gold from you. And if you want to buy gold, today is the day that it went up 0.8% to $3,332. Maybe because everything else went down. The Dow went down 0.34. NASDAQ went down 0.1. And, the NASDAQ was flat. S&P went down 0.1. Gold went up. Why? Because they're shooting again in Pakistan and India, and that just makes people jittery. If you're going to buy or you're going to sell gold, do it with Nick Grovich and his team. Call them at 1-800-221-7694. 1-800-221-7694. The most important thing you can do when it comes to buying gold is do it with someone you can trust. Nick's been in this business for 42 years. His team knows what they're doing. No games. Very straightforward. How much you want to buy? Here's the commission. Get the money here. You want to sell to them, tell them what you've got to sell, and you'll figure it out from there. There's very few collectors out there. Nick's your man. But really, if you're just buying ounces or bars, Nick Grovich is your guy. 1-800-221-7694. 1-800-221-7694. AmericanFederal.com. Joined as I am most Fridays when I am blessed by Ben Domenech, who is, of course, editor-at-large for The Spectator. He is also a Fox News contributor and now the host of the Big Ben podcast, to which I will be liking and subscribing immediately after the show. I just learned about the Big Ben podcast. And I'll get back to that, but not before I bring up the fact that Big Ben fired the first shot during the doubleheader between the Guardians and
I trolled you at the worst possible time.
You did. You trolled me just when I was down, and then the Guardians went on to take the next 2 out of 3. The Guards, by the way, are 2.5 behind the Tigers, 22-15. They're the leader in the wild card in the AL East, in the American League, I mean. Nats are 17-21. 7 games back in their own division, and apparently they forgot you have to have a bullpen to play Major League Baseball.
Let me put it this way, Hugh. Here are a couple of stats for you. If the season ended today, the Nats bullpen with an ERA following that Guardians series of 7.22 would be the worst bullpen performance in history since the merger, since the actual integration, I should say, of baseball. So you never want to be worst since integration. But I will just say this: the thing that is fun about the Nationals, and it's one of the reasons why I love going to so many games, is that they're the second most, they're the second in scoring in their division. Well, the problem is they're also second in giving up runs.
That first game that you threw the dart at me online, it was 8-6 when I talked about it on the radio, and then the Nats came back and won 10-8, I think, and it was crazy. And then the same thing happened in the doubleheader. I don't know how you watch a team like that without a bullpen. The Guards have the best bullpen in baseball.
I'll tell you, it's very fun. When they're up, and it's very sad when you start going down because you know it's not. There is no bottom.
It's sort of like Cavaliers fans this week. They're 0-2 and they're going to Indiana, and it was a dagger to the heart in that second game.
Well, I have to say, Halliburton is a fine player, and that's one of the reasons that I don't know if the Cavs can come back, but I would be more worried if I was a Celtics fan, because that's the team that, frankly, should be quite embarrassed at the situation that they're in.
I don't. Knicks, they gave Nick some breath of life. They got to go play in the Garden. I mean, they got to go play 2 in the Garden, and so it's dicey. This is the first time that both the first and the second seed have been down 0-2 in the semis, in the conference semis. So we will see. Let's get to the important stuff, Ben. Historic yesterday. I mean, just a big day. People will be talking about this for centuries. The choice of an American Pope. What was your reaction? What is your reaction? I talked to Vice President Vance at the start of the show. He's quite eloquent about this. What does Ben Domenech think?
Well, I read the transcript, duly run up, by the way, by your producer Dwayne. I had no idea that he could type that fast.
Yeah,
and it was certainly, heartfelt, everything that the vice president had to say about it. For me, it was actually just a reminder for me to urge all of my friends to watch The Young Pope and make meme references. But look, the fact that the Pope has had opinions about Caleb Williams versus Jaden Daniels, in all likelihood, in the last couple of years, it's something that I find quite heartening. I think it's
and he knows about Jim McMahon and the Bears. I mean, he knows about
100%.
Ditka.
He was there during the 80s. I mean, and I do think that the Cubs did themselves no services by jumping the gun and assuming he was a fan. Turns out he's a fan of the White Sox. But one of the things that I think is good about this is that the frame of the media, as you know, Hugh, is going to be the Pope versus Donald Trump. And I think that was always going to be the case, whatever happened, coming out of this. But I actually think that this Pope is it seems to be, in terms of initial assessment, to be a pretty sophisticated, not easily, put in a box one way or the other on things, pretty clear on what he thought about gender teaching in Peru, at least. And we'll see how he approaches it. But look, this is incredibly important. The first American Pope is incredibly important. And I think that, sometimes the media likes to play these games with religion that I think are very inappropriate. But one thing that I do think is valuable is to acknowledge and look, the Catholics in my life who are American felt very proud about this. And I think that they should, because it's a good thing for the country, and it's a good thing for the world to have someone who understands America and understands it in this moment when I think the American experiment and the role that we have to play in the world for the future and balancing against a lot of evil elements in it is so critical.
Yeah, Ben, one of the things I mentioned to Matt Cottonetti last hour is I'm listening since the death of Francis. I've been listening to a book by Robert Cardinal Sarah of Guinea, one of the Africans. He's 79. It's called The Day Is Now Far Spent. I'm showing it to people who are watching on the Salem News Channel on my iPhone. And the interesting thing about this book is he is so down on the West, on the emptiness or the sort of vacuuming up of our history, the draining away of our culture. He's just as down on Europe, having forgotten that it came out of Christendom and it is embarrassed by Christendom and nobody believes Jesus is Lord. I actually think his first sermon today was very uplifting. He's going to be an evangelical pope, not a political pope.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis, and I also think that one of the things that we have to understand about this current moment in our history is that we have never been in more need of a true religious revival in the West than I think we are right now, in terms of all the different things, all the different elements of life that are leading you astray and that are leading you away from family and neighborhood, from commitment and from understanding of the world around you and the right priorities. There's so many things that pull at us in those directions, and that kind of default secularism, that default atheism, or not even passionate enough to say that it's atheism. It's a kind of dismissal of the idea that these are the things that fundamentally matter. And someone who can bring that back, that understanding that this is the whole world at war over whether something is a terrible lie or a divine hope, is something that I think is at the core of our understanding of the way we are as human beings, the way we need to live as friends and neighbors and family.
I'll talk with you about this during the break, but I want to make sure the whole audience hears about the Big Ben pod, because I do believe podcasting is going to save information flow and is going to redeem the internet. So I'm glad to hear you've entered the list in a big way as opposed to a little way. What are you going to do with the Big Ben pod?
So what we're going to do, and we did it on Wednesday with my friend Lucas Tomlinson, sat down with me. We fortuitously actually ran into each other at Nats Park for his youngest first game, which was that win over the Guardians. And he and I sat and talked about his trip to Estonia, his trip to Saudi with the president. And then we also, I went on a rant about these Hollywood tariffs and the good and the bad of them. And then also had a great conversation at the end about Mother's Day and about a number of other random topics. It's really much more, look, I'm a radio guy, Hugh. I love radio. I love talk radio. I love listening to that kind of stuff. And I think that this is something of a hybrid between that world that you inhabit so well and the podcast world. And I'm very optimistic about it. This is something that I've been wanting to do for basically more than a year. And the fine folks at Fox have made it happen finally. And we're going to have in-studio interviews in the upcoming weeks with major political figures and authors. Next week, we're going to have a conversation with David Zweig, whose new book about the pandemic choices about schooling is such a it's an indictment of everything that happened here in America, particularly. And in the coming weeks, we'll have senators and Speaker of the House, a number of other folks who we will bring in to do in-studio interviews. I think it's just great to do stuff that's in studio, Hugh. It makes such a good.
And I love long form. I think, God bless Joe Rogan for opening people's eyes to this, but he's a comic. I am enamored of the commentary pod. I'm enamored of the National Review, the editors, Andy McCarthy's report. I'm enamored of Getting Hammered. I know I'll be enamored of Big Ben because long-form conversations among smart people teach me things. I think that hunger is immense. We got a minute to the break, Ben.
Yeah. I mean, a good example of that, quite frankly, is, people may not, know Lucas all that well, but he, normally when he goes on Fox, he's going on for 60 to 90 seconds. And he's given you, a perspective on things from all around the world, that is condensed. And to be able to talk to him about, what it's like to go and cover, a major presidential trip overseas and that kind of thing is really eye-opening. And it helps, I think, people understand there's so much depth that is out there in this that doesn't get touched on in the world of television, can't be touched on really in cable, and that's something that I think we shouldn't cede to just, a handful of folks who, have established this idea that they're able to do long form. I love long form myself.
They have first mover advantage, but that doesn't mean people can't catch up like the Big Ben pod. Ben, one of the things I talked to President Trump about this week and Vice President Vance is Trump derangement syndrome. And it's not a joke. The new issue of The Atlantic, which I think I've now thrown away after I've used it for both of those interviews, is, warning about autocracy, and it's the usual suspects. And then Susan Glasser went off the edge again in the New Yorker today. I really genuinely do not know what has happened to these people. He's won 2 elections legitimately. He lost one. He is not far afield from most standard positions. He's actually kind of an old Democrat turned new Republican. What is it that makes people crazy about it?
Can I ask you a question about this, Hugh?
Yeah.
You have a longer memory than me. Is this worse than Nixon?
I'm not that old, unfortunately, but I am told by the people that I knew Nixon from 1978 forward, but I was 22 then and he'd already resigned. Yeah. I am told by people he was as hated as Trump was, and that's by Dwight Chapin and people like that.
So when I interviewed him, I asked him, the president, about Nixon, and he said, the worst mistake that he made was stepping down. He should have fought. He should have, held out, essentially. And you can debate that, but the thing that really stuck out to me was he immediately had an answer, meaning that he didn't have to think about it. This is clearly something he had thought about before. And I really think that in history, you look back at, the fact that ABC had a special, the night of Nixon losing that California election, and that they invited Alger Hiss to come on, and talk about it.
Yeah.
It's
communist, communist spy.
The way that they hated him in perspective, historically, looks insane, especially because we're talking about the guy who created the EPA, was a fairly moderate Republican in terms of a lot of his views. So the point is just that you look at a guy like Trump and you say, you and I both know there's always this strange new respect, the strange new respect that emerges for the last Republican president. He never would have been like this guy. And we all could see that with J.D. Vance, the guy who you interviewed earlier on this program. There's going to be somebody at The Atlantic writing the piece in 2028 say what you will about Donald Trump, but he's not crazy like J.D. Vance. That's totally going to be
let's mark that down. Let's mark that down for May 9th of 2025. Ben Domenech predicted the first strange new respect for Donald Trump against J.D. Vance. You're absolutely right, of course. And although I'm not sure he'll be the nominee. We got a minute. I do think we're going to have
I don't mean that he may not be the nominee. But again, they could do it with anybody. But the point is just this. That's how crazy this really is, because this guy has been in all reality. He is more conventionally Republican in terms of his policies than I think people appreciate. Every single time he does something, they react with their hair on fire. They react, as if this is insane and we're, slouching towards fascism. But the reality is that he is much more in the main line of what conservative voters want, what Republican voters want, and what independent voters want, which is why he got back to the presidency in the first place.
Amen. If you're just tuning in, my guest is Ben Domenech, editor-at-large for The Spectator. He is a contributor at Fox News. He is now hosting the Big Ben podcast, the first edition of which features Lucas Tomlinson, tremendous war and national security correspondent for Fox News. And I want to ask you about a trial balloon that went up yesterday about raising taxes on the highest income Americans. I think this is a horrific idea. I think it's Dick Darman 2.0. I don't care if they set it at 5 million. It doesn't impact me, but I'm afraid of the impact politically of Republicans raising taxes. It's just not what we do, Ben. What do you think?
I think it's both out of nature and I think it's unwise. Look, the truth is that the way that this argument has been seeded by many who should know better, I think is very unfortunate. It's actually not a populist opinion from my perspective. One of the reasons being, of course, that as you and I know, this is the kind of thing that's going to hit a lot of people who own small businesses, who are, major, figures in their neighborhoods and communities in ways that Republicans like to have pillars of communities exist. I don't like seeding this argument to the left about, the idea that this is, a situation where people should be penalized simply for having success and being able to employ and have money flow out of their households into the community as we know that they do. There's other ways to approach this problem and to argue it. But one thing that I do think is important is that Republicans make clear that they're going to stand up for working class Americans and for American families. And that's something that I think is the right inclination when it comes to the way that we structure our tax policy. These people deserve to have a raise every time Republicans come into office, and that raise is achieved by cutting their taxes and allowing them to keep more of their own money.
Oh, the best thing he came up with on the trail, no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security is a big deal for seniors, and I think that's both ends of the working spectrum, people who've retired and people who are working hard at labor jobs.
Yeah, look, there's so many people who are paying so much more in payroll tax than they are in terms of income tax in America. And I think that Republicans need to understand, and this is one thing that Josh Hawley is right about, is those are your voters now. Those are part of your constituency, and representing them and their interests is something that I think is good for the party.
All right, now I want to close on Iran. I talked to President Trump on Wednesday about it. He said, look, they have two choices. They can blow up their centrifuges and program nicely, or we can blow it up viciously. J.D. Vance came on the show and said there is no daylight between the president, Marco Rubio, and Pete Hegseth, that we all agree on the same thing, and the restrainer nonsense is nonsense. Do you think I just can't imagine Trump walking it back and signing on to the son of the JCPOA. It was such a bad idea to begin with. They can't have a nuke. It is that simple.
He's a deal maker, and he hates bad deals, and he knows a bad deal when he sees one. And that's my view of this, and that's a bad deal. So, look, we can be concerned about some of the things that Witkoff has said. Frankly, everything that I've heard from Pete publicly, in saying, definitively that we could not accept any kind of continuing nuclear program within Iran, I view that as being the president's position too. And it's just about getting there. And so you can have debate about how to get there. You can have disagreement about how to get there. But I really do believe that J.D. Vance is actually correct when he says that there is much less of a gap between these different factions than people seem to think. It's more about a disagreement about strategy or a disagreement about approach, and that really is just something that I think the president finds healthy, in the same way that he likes to throw things out there and have people debate it in front of him, and then he comes in at the end and says, "All right, I think you won that argument. I'm going to stay with you on this." And that sort of thing, I think, is pretty healthy and has happened in the past. It's just a lot more public in this administration than it was. And one more thing I'll just say about that. I think that, you have been on the J.D. Vance, sort of deployment bandwagon, earlier than other people have. I think your analysis of the way that Trump is deploying him is dead on. He is sending him out there to do these things, to meet with other world leaders, and to be kind of the tip of the spear on stuff in a way that I think is really helpful to this administration.
He's so smart, Ben. I mean, when I asked him today, you may not have heard, said, "Are you if you act like Vice President Pence did, and you get the last interview with the Supreme Court would-be nominees," and that's what Mike Pence interviewed them all and always gave his recommendation privately to the president. So what would you ask? And he, without a blink, he said, "Oh, that's a good question. I guess I'd want to know if they had courage, because Alito and Thomas have courage, and it takes courage to stand up against the mob these days." That is a brilliant, off-the-cuff answer for a question no one's expecting.
Yeah, no, that's and it's dead on, because it's tied to the fact that we saw the kind of steel in the spine that Sam Alito had during the heyday of that targeting following the leak of the Dobbs decision, which, by the way, is still the thing that I care about the most related to this court. That people talk about different things that they want to know. They want to read the Robert Hur interview. They want to, that kind of thing. That's fine. I want to know who freaking leaked that. It's really bothering me that we don't have an answer to it. And maybe we'll get one someday. But look, I think that courage is totally important. And look, we also don't know at the end of the day, and I think it actually was helpful for Donald Trump to say, I like JD, I like Marco. It gives us some perspective on the fact that this is going to be a competition to lead this new party that Donald Trump has remade, this coalition of the right and independents, who, the media tells us they're only in it because Donald Trump's a celebrity, and they're like, I don't believe that.
I heard Glenn Youngkin last weekend, and he blew the roof off of the Job Creators Network Summit.
Heard. No, I was not there because I was out of town, but I have. You are probably the 14th or 15th person to tell me about this, that he is definitely somebody who people are keeping an eye on. And look, though, there's a race to be won in Virginia this year that is going to be very competitive, and the left is going to pull all its stops out, and they're going to enlist all the bureaucrats in Northern Virginia to come out against Winsome Sears, and we're going to have to see what happens. I'm
going to do everything I can to vote for Winsome Sears and work hard for and have her on, but it's just an uphill battle and an off year when you've won the White House in Virginia,
yep,
right?
It always is. It sickens me that we have this stupid system where popular governors can't run for re-election in this.
But Loudoun County is helping her. I don't know. Have you followed this?
It most certainly is, but with craziness, and unfortunately at the cost of the experiences of our young men and women. It's heinous. I lived in Loudoun County, by the way, Hugh.
Heinous
for 25
is a good word.
Years.
Heinous is a good word. It is heinous.
So it's unacceptable what they've done.
Why did you live in Loudoun County?
Sorry?
Why did you live in Loudoun?
My family, when we moved up here, we couldn't afford to live closer in, and so my dad had a long commute.
I got to tell you, I don't know what happened in that county. It used to be a red county and had good schools, and it's been nothing but crazy for 10 years.
Crazy has moved west outside of D.C., and it's very unfortunate, but still a beautiful place. Still a wonderful place.
Still might get Winsome Sears elected because parents are going to remember everything about this. Ben, congratulations on the launch of the Big Ben Pod. I'm sure it's available at Apple, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you go. Go get the Big Ben Podcast, like and subscribe right away. Be smarter than anyone else. Thank you, Ben Domenech. I'm so happy to conclude my Pope Leo commentary with Andrew C. McCarthy because he's a little bit younger than I am, so he doesn't even have any memory of Paul VI, I doubt. But he's a John Paul the First and Second and a Benedict and Francis guy, and he's an American Irish Catholic like I am. And Andy, what was your reaction yesterday?
I was stunned. Paul VI was the Pope. You're not that much older than me. I hate to say, but he was the Pope when I was a kid and when I was a young altar boy, and when I was telling my son yesterday, he couldn't believe this, but you actually had to memorize the Latin Mass before they would let you serve Mass.
Absolutely. And then they pulled the rug out from underneath us. Then it was English. It wasn't fair.
No, it was worse for some of the priests, because then they had to start looking at the people in the church instead of have their back to them. That was frightening.
So it's such a shock. What upon reflection, what are your first thoughts about what's coming?
Well, I would be surprised to see a stark departure from Francis, just because of the close working relationship that I understand the new Pope had with the last Pope. But the church is a great institution. It's obviously a much stronger and divine institution compared to the failed people who have to administer it. And I always think there's hope. So,
I think there's great hope. I've talked to some Catholics, senior and junior, and Francis was very antagonistic towards the Americans. I kind of think this is a bridge back to get the American Catholics back on board, because people like Archbishop Gomez in Los Angeles, who should have had a red hat like 15 years ago, hasn't got one. And that's just because he's a traditionalist Opus Dei Catholic. And I just, it's unnecessary given that it's a universal church, Andy. I do think it will be useful to have someone who can communicate in English subtly. I'm not sure Francis was very good at that. Do you think he was?
No, I don't. But, the funny thing, Hugh, is the most powerful experience I had, I think, in the last 30 years was in connection with the embassy bombing case. I was actually in Kenya for a few weeks to interview people for the death penalty phase of the trial, and it was unbelievable how vibrant the church was in Africa. Yeah. Especially having, lived in at that time I still lived in the Bronx, but growing up in New York and in the East Coast, and not that it's any different in the West Coast where you were, but it seemed like in the United States and Europe, the church was becoming moribund, and then you went to some place where it was really alive, and you recognized that it's really about, the gospel and the institution. It's not,
it's not politics. It's not politics.
Yeah, right.
I talked to J.D. Vance about it earlier, and the vice president thought his first sermon was beautiful. I think of pragmatic things like the Notre Dame, BC, Holy Cross, Georgetown alums must just be deeply jealous of Villanova right now. I mean, they just got to be dying.
That's true. That's right. That's right.
They go from on top, and Villanova is you're not Notre Dame, but now all of a sudden they've got a pope. Andy, I want to continue this into the break. Ed Martin has been withdrawn. I guess Judge Pirro has been nominated. I haven't seen anything official yet. Put those two aside. What ought a U.S. attorney to be? Like Tim Garrison is my ideal, Steve, U.S. attorney, serious guy, prosecutor, Marine, just a good guy. Who ought to be a U.S. attorney in D.C.?
Well, look, I think you have to have a mastery of federal law, and you ought to have been a trial lawyer. And I always think that the best lawyers and the ones I tried to emulate as a prosecutor were the ones who, they were good trial lawyers, but they made sure they could beat you on paper, too. They're just very well-rounded. I actually think Janine will be good in Washington. I actually had the opportunity to speak to her in connection with what I think is going to be her last radio broadcast in New York. And the reason I think she's good for that job is Washington is like more than half a local job, not just a federal job, just because of jurisdiction. And it plays to her skill set because she was a very fine district attorney in Westchester County, but she also at that time worked with a lot of federal task forces, which I know because I was running the U.S. Attorney satellite office at the time. So I
Oh,
think
Andy, stick around and tell me a little bit more about that during the break. That is something I did not know. I really don't know anything about Judge Pirro other than what I see on the five. So I've known a lot of district attorneys over my career, and they've all been state district attorneys, county district attorneys, and they run the range from mediocre to okay. And I've never thought they were going to win the spelling bee anywhere up against a federal United States attorney. You're telling me Judge Pirro might be able to do just fine in this job?
Yeah, well, number one, I have to say that my experience about that is different in New York. We had for many, many years after he was U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, Bob Morgenthau was the Manhattan District Attorney and ran a very professional district attorney's office. My experience with the DAs in the city and just outside the city, Janine was in Westchester, which is a big office. I had very good experience with the prosecutors in New York. I agree with what you're saying as an assessment, like broadly speaking, but in New York, I just think you had, in a compressed area, an unusually large number of good lawyers.
Yeah, I've always been against electing prosecutors. I've never thought that was a good idea.
It's not. You're right.
Why is that?
Seen it. Well, I think it wasn't a big deal in the days when Morgenthau was the district attorney in Manhattan, because there was a certain standard and expectation professionally that you expected out of prosecutors. Like, you would never say, elect me and I'll go after our political enemies. That would have been disqualifying back in those days. But if it becomes a norm that the law enforcement system gets politicized, then electoral politics becomes a huge problem. I think as long in New York as, even though you had a one-party system and whoever got nominated by the Democrats was going to be the DA, as long as the norm was that we wanted a highly professional, real prosecutor who would not be politicized, that was an okay system. But once it becomes politicized, the electoral politics makes it much worse.
No, that's my general view, is that when you run for office as a prosecutor, you have to make promises to people, and that sometimes they're not in the best interest of the rule of law. Andrew C. McCarthy, the McCarthy Report is must listening. Haven't listened to it yet this week. It's my morning workout, and I got to go to Minneapolis tomorrow. So thank you, Andy, for making time for us today. Talk to you again next week if we are lucky. Don't go anywhere, America.
Thanks so much, you.
Thank you. Andrew C. McCarthy, who is the guest on the McCarthy Report every week with Rich Lowry of National Review, stuck around with me during the break to talk about Judge Jean becoming the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. So, Andy, I've known a lot of district attorneys over my career, and they've all been state district attorneys, county district attorneys, and they run the range from mediocre to okay. And I've never thought they were going to win the spelling bee anywhere up against a federal United States attorney. You're telling me Judge Pirro might be able to do just fine in this job?
Yeah, well, number one, I have to say that my experience about that is different in New York. We had for many, many years after he was U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, Bob Morgenthau was the Manhattan District Attorney and ran a very professional district attorney's office. My experience with the DAs in the city and just outside the city, Janine was in Westchester, which is a big office. I had very good experience with the prosecutors in New York. I agree with what you're saying as an assessment, like broadly speaking, but in New York, I just think you had, in a compressed area, an unusually large number of good lawyers.
Yeah, I've always been against electing prosecutors. I've never thought that was a good idea.
It's not. You're right.
Why is that?
Seen it. Well, I think it wasn't a big deal in the days when Morgenthau was the district attorney in Manhattan, because there was a certain standard and expectation professionally that you expected out of prosecutors. Like, you would never say, elect me and I'll go after our political enemies. That would have been disqualifying back in those days. But if it becomes a norm that the law enforcement system gets politicized, then electoral politics becomes a huge problem. I think as long in New York as, even though you had a one-party system and whoever got nominated by the Democrats was going to be the DA, as long as the norm was that we wanted a highly professional, real prosecutor who would not be politicized, that was an okay system. But once it becomes politicized, the electoral politics makes it much worse.
No, that's my general view is that when you run for office as a prosecutor, you have to make promises to people, and that sometimes they're not in the best interest of the rule of law. Andrew C. McCarthy, the McCarthy Report is must listening. Haven't listened to it yet this week. It's my morning workout, and I got to go to Minneapolis tomorrow. So thank you, Andy, for making time for us today. Talk to you again next week if we are lucky. Don't go anywhere, America.
Thanks so much, you.
I'm back now. I want to tell you about Relief Factor because I'm in the Relief Factor studio, and it's going with me to the Twin Cities tomorrow morning, very, very early. And Relief Factor, for those of you who are new to the show, WBOB, AM 600, FM 101.1. WBOB, listen, I'm going to tell you about it every hour. I'm in the Relief Factor studio. They keep the lights on here, Studio North, where I'll be next week. Studio West when I'm in California. I do move around the country a lot of different things going on. I try and keep moving. As President Trump told the graduates in Alabama, don't lose momentum. And I believe he's right. Just keep moving and say yes whenever you can say yes, and try not to say no when you don't absolutely have to say no, and go to bed earlier if you're tired. And so that get your workouts in, feel better. Getting workouts in means Relief Factor usually. Now, it doesn't work for everyone. 7 out of 10 people keep taking it forever, like me. I haven't taken a supplement for 20 years, except Relief Factor, which I began about a decade ago, and I've kept taking it for that decade. And the reason being, very simply, it works. I don't have minor aches and pains. I do a lot of miles every week. This week I'm a little bit behind. I think I've done 14. I normally like to hit 20 by Friday, but it's been one of those weekends. And probably next week will be wonderful, and I'll be able to catch up on what has been a slow Q1. Heading into the early summer, I'll be able to get more and more time out on the highways and byways of the North. But in the meantime, if you have not yet tried it, the starter pack is discounted, $19.95 for a 3-week supply. They lose money on every first order because they want you to try it for 3 weeks, 3 packs a day as opposed to 1. The reason they want you to do that is so that you get the levels of Icarian, curcumin, resveratrol, and omega up in your body. Helps your body's anti-inflammatory system. And so that 3-week trial is less than $1 a day. It's well worth your time, well worth your effort. If you've got anything nagging, bad back, bad knees, you got tennis elbow. I remember my buddy in Cleveland stand up in the front row of the last event I did in Cleveland saying, I had tennis elbow, it was gone in a week with ReliefFactor.com. I make no promises, doesn't heal bones, doesn't cure disease. What it does is help with inflammation. And that's what causes most of your discomfort. So call 1-800, the number 4, and the word relief, 1-800-4-RELIEF, or head over to their website, find the starter pack for $19.95. Again, that's less than $1 a day for 3 weeks, relieffactor.com, relieffactor.com. Now, I do want you to know we have posted Harley has posted the J.D. Vance interview. Vice President Vance spent 20 minutes with me today. That's over at my Hugh Hewitt YouTube channel, which I would ask you earnestly, like and subscribe. It means it goes farther and faster. The algorithm likes the more people that like and subscribe the podcast. And I don't overblow your circuits. We put up 1 or 2 things. We'll put up 3 today. Continenti, Ben, and the Vice President. And that way they come to you independently, and you can listen to a little bit, or you can listen to a lot on the podcast tomorrow. Highly Concentrated Hugh, that's the podcast, which you can also like and subscribe to so you don't miss an edition of the Highly Concentrated You podcast. But I want to read to you what Pope Leo said in his first sermon this morning in English. There are many settings in which the Christian faith is considered absurd, meant for the weak and unintelligent, settings where other securities are preferred, like technology, money, success, power, or pleasure. There are the places where our missionary outreach is desperately needed. There are many settings, he continued, in which Jesus, although appreciated as a man, is reduced to a kind of charismatic leader or Superman. This, he said, is the world that has been entrusted to us. Same world that Benedict warned about, same world that Cardinal Sarah writes about in the book I've been listening to. It's a world that more often than not simply dismisses religion in the West, especially in the, quote, educated West, when in fact it's the only thing that makes sense. You cannot not look at the world around you and conclude there is a God, and he probably doesn't want to hide from us. He'll reveal us to him. He will reveal himself to us if we simply look, listen, read, learn, think. Very happy with the new Pope. Joined now by the poet laureate of the Hugh Hewitt Show, Tarzana Joe. Hello, Joe.
Hello, you habemus papa. We have a Pope.
Indeed.
He's got a lot on his plate. Evangelization, war, peace, Villanova basketball. I never thought in my life I'd say anything like that. But today's poem is about someone else who has a lot on their plate too. I don't see every briefing, though I like to keep in touch. It strikes me this administration tries to do too much. Day after day, the media gets too much information, no time to cover tariffs and the Greenland annexation. Does he have to end a war that isn't really his? Can't he leave the government just the way it is? You have a lot to do, but must you do it all at once? The natives may be getting restless, if you ask Frank Luntz. I know he has a sense of mission and a lot of pride, but learn from all your predecessors. Let the tough things slide. You know the ancient saying, those who can't do teach? Say inflation's transitory, then go to the beach. You should have learned from Biden. Boy, that old man killed it. You pass a bill for infrastructure. You don't have to build it. Wake up at 10:30, take a nap at noon. Learn like Joe to pace yourself. Don't want to peak too soon. The job is really tough. Why would anyone pursue it? But the job is even tougher if you try to do it. And I didn't even mention The Border by Tarzana Joe.
I like the last line, Joe. That will be posted over at tarzanajoe.com, I assume. And I also assume, Tarzana Joe, are you flooded with graduations and wedding poem requests right now at tarzanajoe@reagan.com?
I had a graduation poem I wrote this week for a wonderful young lady. I won't tip it off with any details, but boy, very impressive. Very impressive.
What?
And a wonderful family. And it just warms my heart when I meet these people through poetry.
And they deserve a poem for graduation. I'm sure she will appreciate it. Tarzana Joe can be reached at tarzanajoe@reagan.com, tarzanajoe@reagan.com, and all of his work at tarzanajoe.com, collected including today's verse. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Hugh.
Coming up, my friends, we're going to have the Hillsdale Dialogue with Dean Matt Spaulding. He and I are not going to talk popes. We're going to talk the American Revolution. 250 years ago last week, 2 weeks ago now, the beginning of the 250th celebration of the American Revolution. And Dean Spaulding and I go back to Lexington and Concord to review it all. All the Hillsdale Dialogues are found at hillsdale.edu or hugh4hillsdale.com, longtime sponsor of the show. Many of you think, another person came up to me this week in town and said, the best thing you do is the Hillsdale Dialogue. And I said, well, that's the least I talk. And they said, well, there might be a connection there. But it's also fabulous content. So get smarter every single week with the Hillsdale Dialogue coming up next. And if you missed Vice President Vance, I'm about to post it again on X from my YouTube account. But the easiest thing to do would be to subscribe to Hugh Hewitt on YouTube. You would not miss a single key interview.